All right, folks, so we will begin Unit 2, the Revolutionary Era. Unit 2, the Revolutionary Era. And the first topic we're going to touch on today is French colonization. So, the Revolutionary Era, Unit 2. In this unit, we'll be discovering or discussing the French colonies. In addition, we'll be talking about the French and Indian War that leads up to the American Revolution. And then we'll talk about the American Revolution thereafter. So, the Revolutionary Era. And specifically first, we're going to talk about French colonization, and we'll move on from there. Questions? Everyone just about ready? Okay, here we go. Bienvenue. On est le pays de France Nouvelle.
Oui.
Vous comprenez? Vous comprenez? Non? On est le pays de France Nouvelle. Il est le père de France Nouvelle, Samuel de Champlain. Vous ne comprenez pas? Est-ce que vous ne comprenez pas? Non? All right. This is New France. And New France was founded in 1608. New France was founded in 1608 by this man, Samuel de Champlain. And Samuel de Champlain, his nickname is the father of New France. So again, in 1608, they founded New France. It was founded by this man, Samuel de Champlain. And his nickname is the father of New France. If this was founded in 1608, that means it was founded a year after what settlement? Don't make me sad. Sure. Jamestown, correct. It's a year after Jamestown, so you should know. 1607 is a date that should be burned into your memories, guys. But anyway, 1608 is when the French colonized. When the French came to America, folks, they came for reasons very similar to the Spanish, but not so similar to the English. They came for one, mercantilism. Which means, what are they looking for?
Gold.
Not necessarily gold. Mercantilism is the search for what? It can be gold, it can be silver. Really, it's more like raw materials that can result in wealth. Does that make sense? So mercantilism is the search for raw materials. But they also came for nationalism. If you remember, at this time, King Louis XIV, the Sun King, is in charge. And he very much wants to expand his empire. Because will that create pride for his country?
Yes.
Of course. So he decides to colonize the New World. Good so far. All right. So if you notice on this map as well, when the French colonized, they colonized in a very specific way. So based on this map, where did the French colonize? Like specifically, what were they colonizing around? What was influencing the creation of their settlements? Carlos.
Water.
Water, correct. The French colonized along waterways. The French colonized along waterways. Rivers, lakes, harbors, those kinds of things. My question is why? Quoi? The French would say. Pourquoi? Why the waterways? Easy access for what?
Trade.
And transport. Very good. So the reason why is they wanted easy access for trade and transport. So if I was based here by the Mississippi River, let's say, I could just sail all the way down the Mississippi and then go back to France. Or if I was here by the Great Lakes, I could just hop onto the Great Lakes and then, I guess, be stuck. I'd have to go somewhere else. Let's say I was here in the Great Lakes, I'd be able to go out this way through the Hudson Bay and out. Make sense? So easy transport and trade. Some of the more famous French settlements that you should know include Quebec or Quebec. 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 Another French settlement that you should know? Montreal, or as the French would call it, Montreal. Yes, ma'am? Sure. Sir, Quebec, Montreal, or Montreal, but Montreal. And of course, the famous city that you guys know today as Detroit, though it's French, so it actually should be pronounced Detroit. Detroit. These are all French settlements, yes. Famous French forts, French settlements established by the French at this time. Questions so far? No? With regard to their picks, folks, politically, they are very similar to the Spanish, which means, what did they not have, just like the Spanish? In terms of politics, what did not exist in the French colonies? No democracy in the French colonies. No démocratie. La démocratie?
Can you do a Russian accent?
Non. Je ne parle pas russe. Je parle seulement anglais, tagalog, chinois, espagnol, et français. Oui. Je peux parler chinois. Je peux parler 5 langues.
You know how to speak 5 different languages?
Oui.
Spanish, Tagalog, Chinese, French.
Anglais.
English. Oh yeah.
Anyway, so they were directly controlled. No democracy there. Secondly, economics. Economically, what were they looking for? So if you note back to where they settled, where were all their settlements along?
Water.
Water. So what might they be looking for?
Fish.
Not fish. Not gold. It's not a mineral. Fish was closer, but that's not right. It's an animal. It doesn't live in the water. It's not a fish. So it's not a shark. It's closer to a bear, but it's not a bear. They're living by the water. Beavers. They were hunting. They came for beaver fur. Economically, the reason why they came was for beaver fur. Why did they come for beaver fur? What can you use beaver fur for? Coats, hats. In fact, folks, again, don't quote me on the actual numbers here. This is just to give you an idea. But they say that the, 1 square inch of human skin has like 300 hairs on it, whereas a beaver has like 1.2 million. So if you think about insulation, will beaver fur keep you very warm? Sure. And it was very prominent at the time. Hats had beaver fur, they lined coats with beaver fur, and people paid top dollar for beaver fur. And so the French went into the New World and they began to look for beaver fur. They were French fur trappers. And the nickname they gave themselves was the Coureurs du Bois, which means the runners of the wood. They would run into the woods and capture beavers and be like, I'm gonna wear you. So that's kind of what they did. So the Coureurs du Bois, or the runners of the wood, was a nickname they gave to people that captured beaver fur. Yes, sir.
How profitable was it?
Quite profitable. I can't give an exact number there, but I mean, it's not like tobacco because you grow so much of it. But again, obviously worth the while to establish a colony for it. But it was very profitable at the time. I mean, better than deer skin because remember, beavers live in water also, and yet they maintain their warmth. And so the fact that it could maintain that much heat was pretty profitable in that regard. Anyway, eventually, in order to maintain the success of this colony, the French sent over the Hudson Bay Company to manage the French colonies. So it was the Hudson Bay Company who ultimately manages the French colonies. The Hudson Bay Company is the one who ultimately manages the French colony. Good there? Socially, the Hudson Bay Company is the one who manages the French colonies. Socially, there are only 6,000 French in the colonies compared to 2.5 million British. So there were only 6,000 French in the colonies compared to 2.5 million British. Based on those numbers, do you think the French were trying to establish a permanent settlement or a temporary settlement? Temporary, right? Because again, they're not going to stay here for very long. They're going to come here for the beaver fur, and once it's gone, are they going to go back home? So that also explains why they have no democracy, right? Are you going to teach these men democracy and then have them go back home to a monarchy? No, that's not going to fly in France. So they don't have any democracy because it's a temporary settlement. And they only have 6,000 people because are they going to raise families here? Are they going to reestablish French society? No, they're here temporarily. So very few. All of these people that came, unlike the British, were also loyal to the king. They were all loyal to the king. And the reason why is, unlike the British, the French kept their unwanted. The French kept their unwanted. Let me explain what that means. In the British colonies, what did we do with the people that we did not like in England? What did we do with them? We sent them to America. So what did we do with the Puritans? Send them to Massachusetts. The Quakers, sent them to Pennsylvania. The Boer, we made them indentured servants. If we didn't like them, we sent them out of the country. But the French, especially with the French Protestants, are you guys familiar with the Huguenots? You should have learned that in world history. The Huguenots were French Protestants that had this massive civil war with French Catholics. And what ended up happening is the French Catholics won. And so instead of kicking the French Protestants out, they said, you're going to stay right here so we can keep an eye on you. So you know the philosophy of keep your friends close, your enemies closer? That's what the French did. Because if they sent the French Huguenots to America, what might they have done? Yeah, built an army, rebelled, and attacked France again later. The French didn't want to have to deal with that, so they kept the unwanted close. Whereas the British were all about, oh yeah, get the hell out of my country. You can go to America, just be loyal. And that was it, and that's what they did. So very different in terms of the type of society created. Also, you should know, in terms of their relationship with Native Americans, they had a great relationship with Native Americans. The French, they traded with the Native Americans. They traded with them. They traded with the Native Americans. They traded goods. I am speaking English with my French accent. So this is not French. This is English. They traded goods, skills, goods, skills. Basic idea being that they could trade beaver fur for guns, pelts, whatever else. But did the natives have skills that the French could learn from? Yes. Like they knew where the beavers were. They knew how to trap them. So they said, you train us how to do this, we'll show you how to use guns, vice versa, okay? So they traded guns and skills. Exactly. So they would trade goods and skills. They actually married Native Americans. They intermarried with Native Americans. Were the British willing to do that? No, the British did not want to have anything to do with the natives. But they married with them. They did convert some to Christianity. They did convert Native Americans to Christianity. Yes, ma'am?
How do they interact, talk?
So, it's always a good question. How did different societies interact with each other for the first time? A lot of pointing and grunting. I mean, really, that's what it is, right? Like, I didn't speak Spanish for the longest time until I actually tried to learn. And so the first time was like, paper. Like, papel. Like, oh, got it. Or like, cup. Vaso. I don't know. Doesn't sound right to me. But again, it's a lot of pointing and grunting, and then a lot of gesturing, and then eventually the language emerges. Like, you'll figure it out eventually. That's true for, like, if you go to China today, it'll be the exact same thing. Picking up Chinese from you was very difficult for a time. And then you just figure it out. And you take classes too. You know, you still figure it out. Anyway, also they would protect Native Americans from the British, which is actually pretty unique. The British would chase the Native Americans, and the Native Americans would hide in French forts, and then that'd be it for the British. They'd be like, oh, I'll get you next time.
It's like running to an embassy.
Exactly. It's like running away to an embassy to protect you, that kind of thing. So, is the French colony very different from the British colony? But it's also pretty similar to the Spanish colony, right? Maybe they came for a few different reasons, whatever else, but it's more Spanish than it is British. Good so far? Okay. So, that's the Spanish colonies. You should be able to compare that with that's the French colonies. You should be able to compare that with the Spanish and the British. Next thing we're going to talk about then is the causes of the French and Indian War. The causes of the French and Indian War. This is the war that will lead to the frustrations that will cause the American Revolution. It's like 2 steps away from American Revolution. But this plays a pretty important role. The first thing we're going to talk about with regard to causes is the long-term causes. So I'll just call it long-term. And the long-term causes, the definition I'm going to give you is the following. The long-term causes of the French and Indian War were the ongoing conflicts between the British and the French. The ongoing conflicts between the British and the French. I mean, think about it, folks. Have the British and the French been fighting for years? I mean, there's one war that's called the 100 Years' War. And that's just like one time that they fought each other for 100 years. And then there's just like the 7 Years' War, the 9 Years' War, the Habsburg Wars. I mean, like, they're just fighting all the time. So it's not like it was only just beginning. Like, they've been doing this for years. There's an ongoing conflict. So do they already hate each other? Definitely. So I'm going to list 4 wars. You just need to know they happened, and you don't have to really know too much about them. So here are the 4 wars that led to the French and Indian War. The first is King William's War. Again, these are wars that led to the French and Indian War. So first is King William's War. Again, I'm not going to make you write down what happened in each individual war. I'm sure you can take a class on King William's War. We're not going to do that. Next is Queen Anne's War that followed. Here's another war that led to the French and Indian War that followed thereafter. King William's. Now you have Queen Anne's. This war is followed by War of Jenkins Ear, which is literally caused when Captain Jenkins was trying to smuggle goods. He was caught by Spanish sailors and they cut off his ear. And so he went back to England complaining, and then the British were like, "You can't cut off one of our people's ears, to war!" So that happened. A war caused by getting some ear cut off. And then King George's War. Another war that happened. It's not exciting. Just stuff that you should know. If you need to remember them in order, one mnemonic device is it's William, Anne, Jenkins, George, right? So I like to put in a sentence, will Anne Jenkins George? I don't know, will she? Will Anne Jenkins George. And you can say that Jenkins like a verb that means like to cut off someone's ear. Like, hey, don't make me Jenkin you. Now it becomes like a thing. It was like, will Anne Jenkins George? I don't know, his ears seem very rigid. I don't think she'll be able to Jenkin his ears. See, now it's a thing. Anyway. The short-term cause of the French and Indian War, though, the thing that immediately led to the war, is conflict in the Ohio country. Conflict in the Ohio country. conflict in the Ohio country. Here's what was happening, folks. The British colonies are here, right? So in which direction can they only expand? Can they expand into the ocean? No. They can only expand west. So here they are expanding west. And the French, they own territory up here, above the Ohio Valley and below the Ohio Valley. So which direction are they going to expand? Well, inland. And are they going to come into conflict in that Ohio Valley territory? Because they both want territory here. Good so far? Here's what happens. The French built a fort called Fort Duquesne. Now, you Americans might pronounce it Duquesne, but it's not. It's Duquesne. Fort Duquesne. Okay? And so they built Fort Duquesne in order to say, we now control the Ohio Valley. But are the British okay with that? No, so the British colonists, they create a fort not too far away called Fort Necessity. Good there? Okay, so you have Fort Duquesne and Fort Necessity, and this is created by the British, and that's created by the French. And when you have two forts in the same region, not that far from each other, what do you expect to happen eventually? War, battle, whatever else. Are the colonists happy that, or are the British colonists happy that the French have built a fort here? Like, this is our land. So, the British colonists attack Fort Duquesne. So the British colonists attack Fort Duquesne, and it's important to note, the British colonists. The British colonists attack Fort Duquesne and start the French-Indian War. And by the way, I just like to abbreviate French-Indian War as FRIND. I call it FRIND. But the French-Indian War, that's how I abbreviate it. So the British colonists attacked Fort Duquesne and started the French-Indian War, or the FRIND. That's the details you have to know. Here's what you don't have to know, but I think it's kind of cool. So the British attacked Fort Duquesne, and they lost. So they retreated back to Fort Necessity. And the French were like, oh, it's payback time. So the French attack Fort Necessity, and they win. And they take Fort Necessity over. The colonists are not too happy about it. And among the hostages that they capture at Fort Necessity is our good friend, Colonel George Washington. He's not a general yet. He's this young lad, you know, no more than like 20-something. And he's just, you know, getting his feet wet in war. But he's captured. Now, what's interesting is that he was actually very formal about it, and they were like really willing to release him, so they let George Washington go. But in one of the battles that George Washington was fighting against the French in this war, he's commanding his own troops, and in two different situations, he's shot at, but he's missed, and they kill the horse underneath him twice. So that means when he was being shot at, they missed him, and they killed the horse beneath him twice. At the end of the battle, they realized that George Washington's coat was full of bullet holes. So they're like, oh my gosh, Colonel George Washington, are you hit? And he wasn't. So George Washington's coat was full of bullets, which means like bullets were flying in his sides, his back, his horse was killed underneath him, and yet he himself was not scathed by a single bullet.
A witch.
Which goes to show that George Washington is either a witch or immortal. Now, the story goes that because of that battle, the gods, or God, clearly chose George Washington to be president of the United States, because why else would he have gone unscathed in that battle? So, there's a cool story about George Washington. There's many more we'll talk about later. He just was lucky. Or telekinesis. Maybe created like a force field around. No, he was just lucky. I mean, he did not get hit that battle. Yeah, so it hit his jacket, but it didn't like pierce him. So like it shot while his jacket was like flailing, and it was like very Matrix style like, but he himself was never shot. Anyway, so the war begins. By the way, again, who started this war? The British colonists started this. Now, the British colonists start this war, and Benjamin Franklin at the time, in 1754, introduces something called the Albany Plan of Union. And he suggests, hey, colonists, there's 13 colonies here. What if us 13 colonies do what? Unite. So he suggested a plan where the 13 colonies under the Albany Plan of Union, all 13 colonies unite under one military alliance. He suggested that all 13 colonies, Benjamin Franklin suggested that we unite under one military alliance and colonial government. Military alliance and colonial government. So he suggested that we unite, Benjamin Franklin suggested that we unite under one military alliance and colonial government. Good so far. That was the idea. He said, if we join forces, then us 13 colonies will combine and be as powerful as a snake. But if we don't join forces, what's going to happen to us? We shall die. Well, you should probably sketch this in your notes real quick. Just like a broken up snake, just go like, and then like, snake, and then join or die. That's what I do in my notes. You should quickly sketch this because you should know this flag in your notes. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just get the basic idea of a broken up snake and then join or die underneath, because that's the join or die flag. This, by the way, is unsuccessful. It's unsuccessful. And the reason why the Albany Plan of Union is unsuccessful is that at this time, the colonists, all 13 of us, have a common identity. Do we see ourselves as Americans yet?
No.
No, I see myself as a Virginian. You see yourself as a person from Massachusetts. That's a New Yorker. That's a Bostonian. That's a Georgian. Does that make sense, folks? We're still so unique in our own colonies, we don't even see each other as the same. And so this, unfortunately, is unsuccessful because the colonies... What's the best way to put this? The colonies are too concerned with their own identity and self-government. The colonies are too concerned with their own identity and self-government. The colonies are too concerned about their own identity and self-government. Because am I, as a Massachusetts governor, gonna send my troops to defend Virginia? No. And as a Virginian, I'm not gonna send my troops to defend Georgia. And a South Carolinian is not gonna send his troops to defend New York. I defend my country, my people. I'm a New Yorker, I defend New York. So again, they're not united yet. But will this flag reemerge again in about 12 years? During when? During the American Revolution, right? It's the same idea will emerge again. Many might be thinking, why aren't there 13 pieces? New England kind of like says like all the New England colonies are in New England. That's the basic idea. So like Plymouth, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, they're all in there. Good with the Albany Plan of Union. So it fails, but is it a good idea? But it's not gonna work, unfortunately. So let's talk about the war. Very quickly, the war. The war, or la guerre. Now, this is a war between the French and Hurons versus the British and the Iroquois. Ruiz.
Oh, sorry.
So, the French and the Hurons, these are Native Americans. They joined forces versus the British and Iroquois, who are also Native Americans. So the British and the French hate each other. So what do you think about the Iroquois and the Hurons? They also hate each other, okay? So here's what happens in this war. We're all talking about this fairly simply. In the first phase, this is just colonists versus colonists. This is a war between, what I call the French and Indian War. It's the French and Indians versus the British and Indians. Does that make sense? And in phase 1, where it's colonists versus colonists, plus their natives, I guess, the British lose. In phase 1, the British lose. So, again, and this is a war started by the British, and the British colonists are losing. So is England just going to let the British colonists lose all their territory? No. No. So what is the British government going to have to do? Send troops. They're going to have to send the army. So in phase 2, the British army arrives. And in phase 2, who wins? The British win. Easy, right? Yes, you can take a whole class, read a whole book on the French-Indian War. We're not going to do that today. But in phase 2, the British army joins the war. They win. And that's the end of that story. By the way, this war lasts 1754 to 1763. And this war ends up becoming a world war. This is technically the first world war, because even though it was fought in America, this war also led to fighting in Europe and to British and French fighting in Asia. So this is technically the First World War. We just don't call it that. But it is a global war. And again, who started it? The British colonists. So that's going to have problems, okay? Anyway, everyone good with the war? Simple stuff. War ends, and here's what happens. Before, folks, you see how the British controlled all this territory, and the French controlled all their territory, and Spain controlled all that territory in the south? Well, after the war, they signed something called the Treaty of Paris. And the war ends with the Treaty of Paris. And here's what the Treaty of Paris said. And by the way, this is the first of like 50 Treaty of Parises. There's so many Treaty of Parises. But this is the first of them. In 1763, we signed the Treaty of Paris, and here's what it said. The French agreed to cede all lands east of the Mississippi to the British. They agreed to cede, C-E-D-E, cede all lands east of the Mississippi to the British. And they were going to cede all lands west to the Spanish. So again, the French were going to cede all lands east of the Mississippi to the British and west to the Spanish. Effectively, folks, what happened to the French in North America? The French were kicked out. The only territory they control left is Santo Domingo. That tiny little piece of that island right there. That's all they have left. Because they're like sugar. That's why they were growing it. That's the French West Indies. Pretty much, folks, the British got all this land, right? Remember when previously they only controlled this? So is that a lot of land that they won in this war? Significantly. The reason why the French lost this territory is that they borrowed so much from the Spanish that the only way to pay them back was to give them land. Does that make sense? So they had to pay the Spanish back because they borrowed money for the war, and because they lost, they had to pay them back with land. Don't worry, when Napoleon takes over Spain or like conquers them, he's gonna get the territory back, so no worries there. Nonetheless, the significance of the French and Indian War. The significance of the French and Indian War. A few things you should know. Number one, this war was expensive. The war cost £315,000. It's British money, so It's pounds. It cost over 315,000 pounds back then. So I like to estimate, though I may not be anywhere close. I like to exaggerate from time to time. So let's assume it's like $1.2 trillion. It's a lot. It could be 100 million, but that's still a lot today. Yeah, it's a crazy amount. It's like 100 million, 1.2 trillion, whatever. It's a crazy amount of money. So are the British happy about this? No. The British are angry that the colonists started a war that ended up costing them 315,000 pounds. That's a problem. The other thing that's significant is that it will force the British to rethink their relationship with the colonies. It'll force the British to rethink their relationship with the colonies. Because from 1607 to 1754, folks, did the British really interfere in the colonies? No, they got to do whatever they want, right? They had democracy, they made their own decisions. Pretty much from 1607 to 1754, the colonies were pretty much ignored. The question is, after 1763, what's going to change? Everyone good on the French and Indian War? Solid? French colonization okay? Sweet. So let's just move on to section... Oh wait, no, before we do. One thing that happened after the French and Indian War also that there was a lot of second guessing was Pontiacs Rebellion in 1763. Are the Native Americans happy that the British won? Would they have preferred the French or the British being in charge? The French, they were nicer. But in 1763, you have Pontiac's Rebellion by Chief Pontiac. Like the car. So Chief Pontiac leads a rebellion. And the hope is that this is the last attempt to drive out the British. All the Native Americans decide, okay, let's try to drive out the British. So they unite to drive out the British. Shouldn't they have done that before the French and Indian War? Instead of the natives fighting each other, the Hurons and the Iroquois, wouldn't they have been better off just fighting the British and joining the French? They didn't think about that at the time. They're like, you should have done it differently. But they didn't. So they try to fight off the British. And are the British happy with this rebellion happening in the frontier? Not at all. So they attempt to negotiate. The British try to negotiate. And so winter comes, and during negotiations, the British come to some agreements. And during the negotiations, they tell the natives, all right, guys, so here's what we came up with. It's getting cold, winter is coming, so how about we do this? Go back to your tribes, discuss this with your elders, and then we'll meet up when the winter thaws, and we'll discuss. And because it's cold, why don't you take these blankets with you, give it to your children, whatever else, and that'll keep them warm for the winter. And then when it thaws, we can discuss again. So Native Americans take the treaty, they take the blankets, they leave, and then once the door closes, the British go, and they start shaking their hands and then rubbing, like, we've done it. Because what you didn't realize, and what the natives didn't realize, is that the blankets were infected with smallpox. And what ended up happening was that they gave the blankets to their children, they gave it to the elders, they gave it to the women, and a significant amount of Native Americans were killed. And by the time spring came, could the Native Americans resist the British again? If the British said, we're going to do this now, was there enough of a fighting force to be able to stand up against that? So really what you should know about Pontiac's Rebellion, it was a last attempt to drive them out, and then you should know they were tricked with smallpox blankets. Carlos.
So they were aware that the blankets had smallpox?
It's biological warfare. Is what it is. It's one of the first cases of biological warfare. So yeah, that happened. So I never accept blankets as gifts. Just in case. Like history tells me to be weary of blankets. In all seriousness, no, I'll take a blanket. Now, if I was in war with someone and be like, here's my olive branch blanket, I'm like, no, I'm gonna burn that. I'm a student of history. I think I know what's gonna happen here. But it's plush. Doesn't matter. All right, everyone good with that now? Okay, this brings to Unit 2, the Revolutionary Era and the Road to Revolution. So part 2, the Road to Revolution. What's happening in this picture? Some Native Americans are doing what? They're dumping tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party. We'll talk about that. But before we move on, folks, on your feet. On your feet. Going to stretch real quick. Reach up. Do what you have to do. A quick stretch break. Crack the neck if you have to. Take 3 deep breaths through your nose. And slap yourself on the cheeks if that helps you wake up a bit. I know it's the end of the day, so we'll just try to get you guys awake for the last part of this. And again, when you sit down, make sure your feet are planted firmly on the ground. You're sitting straight. And again, you take deep breaths to keep yourself awake. Ready? Let's go. Down you go. All right. Unit 2, the Road to Revolution, or Part 2, the Road to Revolution. So a lot of changes are going to happen in America, right? Are the British going to let the colonists do whatever they want anymore? No, because what did the colonists just do? They started a war that cost, again, exaggeration, $1.2 trillion. Let's pretend it's the number, because that sounds like a lot. So, 1.2 trillion. So, the first thing we should talk about is the major change. What changed after the French and Indian War that changes everything is the end of benign or salutary neglect. Now, let me explain what benign or salutary neglect means. First off, the word neglect, that means like to be left alone, right? That's kind of not a good thing. But benign or salutary, you know, if you have if your doctor finds a tumor, like, oh my gosh, that might be cancer, so they do it like a scan, but it turns out the tumor is benign. What does that mean? Like, it means not bad. Is it good that you have the tumor? No, but it's not bad. It's not going to kill you. So it's not bad. So benign or salutary neglect in this case is that, yes, the neglect was bad, but did they benefit from it? Sort of. Okay? So for your purposes, benign neglect, or benign just means not bad. They were neglected, but it's okay. It's not terrible. But that's going to end. And here's what happened, folks. Between 1607 and 1754, were the colonists pretty much neglected by the British?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, what did they develop while the British left them alone? Democracy. They developed democracy. If the British were in control, would they have had this, fully, established democracy in the colonies? No, they're still a constitutional monarchy. They might have some democracy, but none of this town meeting stuff. They developed self-government. Guys were governing themselves. They developed their own identity. They were developing their own unique identity. I mean, let's look at these colonists. How many of them had actually been to England before? Guys, fewer than 70% actually had been to England. So would you consider yourself an Englishman if you've never been to England? Your parents never went to England. Their parents' parents never went to England. They've been here for 6 or 7 generations. Are you really an Englishman then? I don't know. But the identity is different. They're governing themselves. They have democracy. They were neglected, but did they learn things? Yes, that's what I mean by benign neglect. Imagine if you're a child, okay? And your parents are working all the time. So in order for you to be able to survive and your parents to go to work, they're going to say, look, me and your dad or your mom are going to have to work at night. You're going to have to learn to take care of yourself. So they go to work at night, they lock the door, and will you learn to mature pretty quickly? Will you learn to iron your own clothes, make your own food, give yourself a bath? Sure, by the time you're 12 years old, are you pretty mature? So yes, technically, did your parents neglect you? Technically, yes. But did you learn from that experience? Yes. Most definitely. You became independent, self-governing. Could your parents trust you? Of course, of course. We have to go out, have a thing to do, so to go out and just watch the house. We trust you, things will be fine. And for those many years, did your parents trust you to just do whatever you want? Because you were responsible. You didn't cause them any problems. You took care of your brothers and sisters, and the house was always fine. And then one day your parents come back from work and the house is on fire. And all of a sudden, all that freedom that your parents gave you, what's going to happen to all that freedom? It's going to go away. All that money that they're going to owe, who do they expect to pay for that? You. You're going to get a job and you're going to pay for all the damages that you caused. Guys, one really good way to look at the relationship between the British and their colony was that it was like a teenager and a parent. That's really what it was like. We trusted the colonies for so long and they were fine. But then one day they screwed up. And was it a big mistake that they made? It wasn't small. It was a huge $1.2 trillion mistake. And then, are the British going to ever trust them again? Are they going to start slowly taking away their rights? Look, I can't trust you. You can't do this anymore. You can't do this anymore. And as a teenager, what would you do in that situation? Are you just going to take it? But no, you trusted me for so long. Why can't I do it? I don't want to. No, I don't like this. It's really easy to imagine America as a whiny teenager getting punished by its parents. So that might help you understand the relationship as we talk about the next few things that happen, because it does for me. That doesn't mean that America was wrong, but it doesn't mean that the British were wrong either. Okay? So, the end of benign neglect was a huge change. Does that make sense? Because now the British are going to take direct control. The British are going to begin to take direct control of the colonies. The British are going to begin to take direct control of the colonies. And that's going to be a fairly big deal.
Take
direct control. Carlos.
When they begin to take direct control from the colonies, all the laws and democracy that they have established just perishes.
Well, the question is whether or not once the British control, will all the colonial laws go away? The British are hoping that if they tell the colonies what to do, they will, and the colonies can still maintain their self-government. But if the colonies refuse, then are the British going to get stricter and stricter and stricter? So what you're going to see, folks, is a progression of British laws that get more and more strict as the colonists whine and complain and rebel and protest. Okay? So, you're going to call this section the Oppressive X. Because the British are going to have to control the colonists, and so they're going to pass a series of acts. The first among them is the Proclamation Act of 1763. The Proclamation Act of 1763. What the Proclamation Act of 1763 said was that colonists may not expand west beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists may not expand west beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So pretty much the orange on this map is where the colonists were currently, okay? All of that yellow, folks, where did all that yellow come from? Where did all this territory come from? The French and Indian War. And so, because they won the war, do the colonists feel like that's their land now?
Yes.
Well, the British say, no, you don't get to have it. You are not allowed to expand in this territory anymore. And they have two reasons why. Economically, Why might the British not want the colonists to expand further west? What are they concerned about?
Profit.
Not necessarily profit, the opposite. Economically, what are they concerned about if the British colonists continue to expand west? What might end up becoming expensive? Wars with Native Americans. Might westward expansion cause further wars? They might cause wars with Native Americans. They might cause wars with the Spanish. So they say they want to prevent westward expansion for economic reasons to prevent costly wars. They want to prevent costly wars with natives, with Spanish. No French anymore, but they want to prevent costly wars. But for political reasons, why might they want to force the colonists to stay behind this proclamation line? By the way, that where they couldn't expand, it was called the proclamation line. They could not expand beyond the proclamation line. Just know that. Why could they not expand beyond this proclamation line? Politically, yeah, Crystal. Democracy might spread is definitely a concern. And really what it comes down to, folks, is this. If you're all in this territory, like you're all in this classroom right now, is it easy for me to control you?
Yes.
Yes, but let's say you guys were outside playing freeze tag across campus. Would it be easy for me to control you then? No. So ultimately what it comes down to, folks, is politically, they did not want to expand so they'd be easier to control. They would be easier to control.
So really, democracy spreading isn't a reason?
It can be. It's not a wrong reason. It's just easier to control. That's ultimately what it was. Because most people are living around towns or cities, right? So if we just put a few troops there, we're done. But if we have people living all over the place, is it going to be easy to control all those people? Absolutely not. The colonial response. The colonial response to the Proclamation Act was outrage. They believed their right to expansion was being taken away. So the colonists were frustrated because they believed that their right to expansion was being taken away. They argued that they earned this land. And what is their argument for earning this land? How did they earn it? They fought for it. I spilled blood for this war. My brother died for this war, or in this war. And so you're telling me now, after all of that, I get none of it? So were the colonists upset? And also for the last 150 years, were the colonists just expanding as much as they wanted? There was no British government saying, oh, you can't expand, no further for you. It was, oh, I'm going to move here, and I'm going to move here, and I'm going to move here. Now the British are saying, no, you cannot expand west beyond the Appalachian line. So they felt that their right to expansion was being taken away. And again, they felt that they had earned the land and it was being denied to them. So are the colonists upset? And do you guys understand why they might be upset?
Yeah.
But do you also understand why the British did what they did?
No.
Yes.
Economic, political reasons. It's important to understand both sides, right? Because this is not a black and white story. Do you think in England they tell the story of how the courageous Americans broke away from the British Empire? No, like those dastardly, childish, whiny Americans breaking away from the empire when we give them everything. So of course, it's a different story. You should know both sides. Next up is the Navigation Acts. The next oppressive act was the Navigation Acts. And the purpose of the Navigation Acts was to restore mercantilism. The purpose of the Navigation Acts was to restore mercantilism, and specifically to force the colonies to trade with who only? The British. To force the colonies to trade only with the British. So again, it was supposed to restore mercantilism and force the colonies to only trade with the British. Just so you know, up until 1764, the colonies were trading with whomever they wanted. The French, the Spanish, because let's say the British were buying goods for like $10, but the French were willing to buy your goods for $30. Who would you want to sell it to? The French, right? The people who could sell triple the price. Well, the Navigation Act said they could only sell or trade with the British, and so the colonists complained that it took away their right to free trade. They said, this is unfair. You're taking away our right to free trade. Shouldn't I be entitled to trade with whomever I please and whoever is willing to pay the most? Sure, said the Americans. But the British replied, you're a colony of the British Empire, not the French Empire. And so your goal is to benefit us. Make sense? So again, two sides of the story, right? Okay. Questions or repeats? Anybody need me to repeat anything? Third one. The Sugar Act. Okay. The Sugar Act of 1764 is a tax on sugar. Let me explain or talk about the cartoon real quick. Who do we think this guy is? Is that a British or an American? That's a British. In fact, that is King George III. So in case you don't know, King George III is the guy in charge at the time. He's British, and does he look like a good guy or a bad guy? Bad guy. Who might this woman represent? Is she an English woman or a American woman? English woman. And how do we know she's probably English? Her teeth. Okay, maybe it's her teeth. But in this cartoon, is she portrayed as beautiful? She's portrayed as an old hag, right? And so it's kind of suggesting that these people drinking tea with their sugar, are they good people or bad people? Bad people. What about these women? Who are they supposed to be? American colonists. And they are anti-saccharites, which means they're anti-what? What's saccharite? It's like a fancy word for sugar, right? Or like a, I don't know, a molecular name for sugar. They are boycotting the sugar. And how do they look? Do they look happy, angry, sad? Sad, displeased, frustrated. And yet, how do we know that they're the good guys? They're not ugly, maybe? What's the color scheme on this side of the image? Very pure, very white, almost angelic, right? You almost tell like, oh yeah, they look so nice on that side. And again, they look like the victims, don't they? So again, the Sugar Act. So let's talk about it. The Sugar Act, again, was a tax on sugar. And the colonists were very upset about it. And the reason why the colonists were upset with the sugar tax is because they believed it took away the power of what? The power over money, to tax, to spend it. What's that power called? What's the power of the money called? What is it called? Power of the purse. They believed it took away the power of the purse. Why am I spelling power? Or purse for the matter. You guys know how to spell those words. Power of the purse, right? They felt like they were taking away power of the purse. Because in the colonies, who had power over money?
Governor.
Not the governor, not the treasurer. Who had the power over money in the colonies? Guys, it's a democracy. The people had power over money. They had power of the purse. So ultimately, they felt that they were losing their power of the purse. They felt that they were losing their self-taxation powers. The power to tax themselves. Because folks, in the colonies, if you were going to pass a tax, did you have to ask for permission first? And again, if you voted against a tax, but it still passed, you might be upset, but did you at least get the right to vote? Yeah, so you're like, but I voted. So, I mean, maybe next time I'll win. Right, so you at least had the power to vote. You had the chance to vote. But in the Sugar Act, are they asking for the colonists for permission? No. They're upset. And instead, with the king, you can't just tell us what to do. The king replied, I'm sorry. Last time I checked, I was king of England, and you were our colonies. And you do what we say as English colonists and subjects. So don't you dare demand that we have to ask for permission from you, because your duty as an Englishman is to benefit the mother country. We don't kowtow and bow down to you to ask for permission. You do what the king and parliament ask of you, and you do it without question. So the colonists were like, no. We're not going to do any of that. The colonists protested naturally. And they protested that this tax was, well, actually what they said was no taxation without representation. A very common phrase you guys should be familiar with. Again, can you be taxed so long as you have the vote? Sure, taxation with representation is okay, but being taxed and not being able to have a voice in that is not okay. So they demanded taxation with representation, and they said no taxation without representation. They said, until we get our way, we are going to boycott. The Americans tried to boycott British goods, or girl caught. That's not a word. But why not? Someone should find out. But anyway, boycotting. Unfortunately, the boycott was ineffective because it wasn't organized. So it was unorganized and ineffective. Let's put it that way. The boycott was unorganized and ineffective. Good there? Now, the other two things as part of the Sugar Act that people did not like were the writs of assistance and the Vice Admiralty Court. This is also part of the Sugar Act. This is part of the Sugar Act. But again, the boycott was unorganized and ineffective. Now, another element of the Sugar Act were the writs of assistance and the Vice Admiralty Court. So this is still part of the Sugar Act. But because we are trying to, again, put a tax on sugar, we want to make sure that no one is smuggling sugar, right? And so they passed something called the writs of assistance. And what the writs of assistance said was that you could search someone's home without a warrant. Very good. So you can search someone's home without a warrant. Make sense? So again, the idea is you're gonna knock on someone's door and open up. We're gonna check your house to see if you have illegal sugar in here. Like, but I don't. Well, it doesn't matter. We're gonna check anyway. Are people okay with that? Oh, we actually have protections against this today, right? Unless you have email and work for the NSA. Yes.
What if they found like sugar, but it was legal? Like,
Then it'd be fine. But they said it was illegal?
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the Vice Admiralty Courts. The Vice Admiralty Courts were military courts. Now, if you are arrested for something, would you want your jury to be a bunch of police officers? Or would you want the jury to be students or your peers? Your peers, right? You want a jury of your peers. Well, the Vice Admiralty Courts were military courts without a jury. Yeah, they're military courts without a jury. And what happened was this. The soldier, or the military was both the, how did I word this? Pretty much all you had to do is it took away the right to a fair trial. Because what would happen is if I was the guy who arrested you for illegal sugar, I would then take you to court and I would also be the person to determine if you were guilty or not. So how fair is that? Imagine if I just put sugar in your house that was legal. And then I said, well, that's not real sugar. I mean, it was legal sugar. I paid for it. And I said, no, you didn't. And then you're going to jail now. Do you get to complain to anyone else? No, because I'm the military. I'm the one who arrests you and decides if you're guilty or not. So is that a fair trial? Absolutely not. Imagine if you were walking, by this pool one day and no one was there, so I punch you in the face. Ah! And we start fighting. So you hit me back. I say, oh, now you're in trouble because you hit me. So I'm going to drag you over to Miss Smalley and be like, this student hit me. Like, Mr. King hit me first. And I'm like, doesn't matter. I'm the one who gets to determine what punishment is. And you're expelled. Is that fair? No, that's not fair. And no, you can't do that. I can't run around to start punching students. It's not something I'm allowed to do. But again, in that scenario, is that okay? Absolutely not. But again, that's what happened back then. And the goal, folks, was to look for smugglers. I mean, really the goal was to look for sugar smugglers. And by the way, among all the crimes you can commit, smuggling is probably the most adorable sounding. What do? I smuggle. Smugglers. You're like, you smuggle teddy bears? Huh? No, people. Oh, that's not okay. That's horrible. You should not do that. But imagine, you know, you're a smuggler. That's like, that touches my heart. Smugglers. It's one letter away from snuggler, you know, so it's almost cute, but then also terrible. The fourth act that you should be familiar with is the Currency Act. Now here's what the Currency Act did. This is actually not a crazy law. Ooh, I forgot one thing. The Sugar Act. The Sugar Act. The reason why we were taxing them in the first place, this is important. The reason why we taxed them was to pay for soldiers. It was to pay for soldiers. Now, the British will say we have these soldiers to what? To protect you. But the colonists believe these soldiers were there to what? Like to control them. So, would you pay a tax so a guy can hold a gun and point it at you? No, that's what the colonists believed they were doing. They were paying for soldiers to control them. And that's why the colonists said, this is crazy. Why am I going to pay for a soldier to point a gun at me? That's nuts. And so that was their frustration. Eileen.
Didn't they have to have like people, like soldiers stay at their houses?
You will get to that. Currency Act. So, what the Currency Act of 1764 said was that it banned colonial money. It banned colonial money. It banned colonial money. B-A-N-N-E-D. It banned colonial money. Because up until the Currency Act, folks, each colony had their own money. You had Virginia dollars, Massachusetts dollars, Georgia dollars, whatever. Each colony had their own money. Because to be fair, were they being forced to operate on their own for the last hundreds of years? So of course they naturally made their own money. But who should honestly be the only one allowed to make their own money? Britain. The country, right? Like, the United States has a dollar, but does California make its own dollar? No, because that would be crazy. What if you had California dollars and you went to Nevada and they had Nevada bucks? Would your money be good there? And would that be very complicated to go from state to state and have different types of money? Sure, so we have the country make the money, okay? And this is why this is not that crazy of a thing to do. It's actually a good idea. And they said they had to switch their money to British money. So all the colonies had to switch all their money to British money, or they could just use gold and silver, okay? So if you have colonial money, what do you have to do with it? Switch it for British money. So again, not that crazy of an idea. Everyone in the colonies will now have the same money, right? Not ridiculous. But there was a problem. There wasn't enough British money. And so it's okay to say we're going to convert all the money to British money, but there wasn't enough money. And there was a deadline. Let's say by the end of September, let's say it was. So we have all this money, right? I have all this Massachusetts dollars, and we're all waiting in line. So we exchange your money and exchange your money, exchange your money, your money. But then by September, there's no more money left. So the four of you in the back, I'm sorry, but you might have all of that Massachusetts and Virginia dollars, but come September, because we have no money left for you, what's your money going to be worth in September? Nothing. So you worked all that time for years, you were saving up all this money, and all of a sudden, it's worth nothing. Is that a problem? Guys, the Currency Act, while a good idea, devastated the colonial economy. It devastated the colonial economy. All that money that you saved up is worth nothing. What if I told you by the end of September, if you don't turn your money into King dollars, your money's going to be worth nothing in America? Would people start scrambling? And would I be able to keep up with that demand? No, and guess what? Half of you will have no money. And then all that work that you did, like, well, I have like $3,000 in the bank. Yeah, well, that's 3,000 US dollars. Is that 3,000 King dollars? Well, then no one cares. Okay, give me your house.
Yeah,
But again, does that make sense, folks? Well-intentioned, poor execution. Are the colonists angry about it? It ruined their economy. So again, do you see why the colonists are progressively getting angrier and angrier and angrier? It's like one after another. Like slap him on the face on the right side, and then the left side, and here comes another right. Like they're really just abusing them from the colonist perspective. The British see it as, we're trying to make our money back because you cost us $1.2 trillion. So, both sides of the story. This brings us to the Quartering Act. Do the colonists refuse to pay tax? They're like, I'm not going to pay no sugar tax. They refuse. But do the British still expect them to pay their share of their defense? Defense, they cost so much money. So they said, fine, if you're not going to pay for their defense, what am I going to make you do?
How's the
Yes! The Quartering Act said that it would force colonists to provide room and board to the soldiers. It would force the colonists to house the soldiers or provide room and board to the soldiers. Yes?
In the Constitution now, you cannot
Yeah,
do that?
Fourth Amendment.
Fourth?
I mean, not fourth, what is it? Third? I think it's third. It's Third Amendment. Fourth is search and seizure. Yeah. Okay, anyway, so room and board. Pretty much, if you're not going to pay the tax, are we going to figure out a way for you to pay for these soldiers somehow? So fine, you're supposed to be paying me $10. That was going to pay for room and board. Not going to do it? Fine. Here's a soldier. You're going to give him room and board. You're not going to give me money? I'm going to make him sleep in your bed. You don't have to be in it, but they're going to sleep in it. So, the way it worked was that, again, are colonists upset about this? They said, oh, it's not money, is it? They complained it was an indirect tax. Because that's what it is, right? If I said you have to give me $2 every day to come into my classroom and you didn't, well, one day if you stop paying me, I'll say, fine. If you don't pay at the end of the week, I'm taking your shoes. Okay? You owe me money. And if you're not going to pay, I'm going to make you give me the money. If you're not going to give me it, then you have to make me lunch tomorrow. $10 worth. Okay, you're going to figure it out how to pay me back what I'm due. Or due. Due. Anyway, so is that going to make colonists angry? Again, they still saw it as no taxation without representation. That was still a frustration for them. But they also believed that it took away their right to privacy. They said it took away their right to privacy. And they were rude, and they were snobby. And again, were these soldiers sent there to protect them? According to the colonists, these soldiers were sent to what? To control them. So again, would you let, like, I don't know, let's say the Chinese took over America. Would you willingly, oh yeah, just sleep in my bed, man. You're good, just watch over me. No, it's not okay. You wouldn't want that. You wouldn't let, like, the prison guard, like, sleep in your bed and be like, oh yeah, then you beat me tomorrow. It's good. I like the way we've set this up. So it's not ideal. The next one. The Stamp Act.
No, this one.
So the Stamp Act is the most hated act of them all. And the reason why the Stamp Act was the most hated of them all is because it affected everybody. It affected everybody. Because the Stamp Act was a tax on what? Not on stamps. Paper, or more specifically, printed documents. but paper is fine. It was a tax on paper or printed documents. The basic idea was every printed document you had to pay a tax on. And who uses paper? Everyone. Do the rich use paper? Poor? Middle class? Everyone. If you're poor and you buy something at the grocery store, do you still have to have paper? Yes, everyone used paper. Whether it was marriage licenses, death certificates, receipts, books, playing cards, newspapers, pamphlets, everything was using paper. And everyone had to pay a tax, and everyone hated it. And to prove that you paid a tax, you had to have this stamp to prove that you paid the tax. And so what some newspapers did was they would put this skull and crossbones saying, oh, that stamp has to be right here because that stamp was supposed to represent like the death of our liberties, right? It's like, oh yeah, the stamp goes on the skull and crossbones because that's what stamp represents. No, the stamp goes here. Anyway, this was the most hated of all the taxes, like I said, because it affected everyone. So in response, the colonists formed something called the Stamp Act Congress. In response, the colonists formed the Stamp Act Congress in protest. They formed the Stamp Act Congress to protest the Stamp Act. Because there was a lot of them that were angry. And in the Stamp Act Congress, they demanded that the British repeal the Stamp Act. What does that mean, to repeal the Stamp Act? To take it back, to get rid of it. So they demanded that the British repeal the Stamp Act. So at the Stamp Act Congress, they demanded a series of things. One, to repeal the Stamp Act. And two, they demanded direct representation in Parliament. They demanded direct representation in Parliament. What is Parliament?
Government.
That's the British government in England, right? That's the act. That's like our Congress today. They wanted direct representation in Parliament. It's the British government. Parliament. Parliament. Now, if not, they threatened a boycott, known as the Non-Importation Agreements. If they didn't get their way, they threatened something called a boycott called the Non-Importation Agreement. And again, this already sounds more organized than the last boycott, right? This one has a name, so you know it's pretty good. Everyone good so far? So there was a boycott, and they said, we want what we want, or we're going to boycott, and we're not going to buy anything British. Well, the British reply, here's the British reply, or the British response to this, to their demands. The British responded by calling the colonists childish. They called them childish. You colonists are childish. If you knew, you guys are so selfish. I don't know if you know this, but do you know that you colonists only pay 1/25th of what we English pay in the mainland? So you're complaining about taxes, but you pay a 25th of what I pay. So how dare you complain when we only ask you to do your part? You only pay a 25th. When I pay $30 in taxes, you know what you pay? You pay on average $1.25. So how dare you complain about taxes when we are doing your part? We're doing our part. So shut up and do exactly what you're supposed to do. The English were upset. Because they said, how are you complaining about this? $1.25 is too much for you? Are you kidding me? So the English were largely upset about what was happening here. They called them selfish. They called them childish. I mean, they really just got in there. Still, the colonists said, it's not about the money. It's about the principle. You know, this idea of taxation without representation. It's not about the amount. It's about the fact that they're taxing us with our consent. Whatever. They were upset. angry, frustrated. So that whole thing happened. Ultimately, folks, the response to this was eventually the British repealed the Stamp Act. The British were forced to repeal the Stamp Act because the boycott was effective. The British repealed the Stamp Act because the boycott was effective. Okay, the British repealed the Stamp Act because the boycott was effective. And the reason why the boycott was so effective, folks, is that 25% of all British exports, they go to the Americas. So what do I mean by exports?
Things going out.
Yeah, stuff that they make in England, 25% of their exports went to England, or went to the Americas. So if America is boycotting British goods, is that going to affect the British economy? Yeah, a quarter of their economy is gone. And the other part is that 50% of all British trade went through the colonies. Whether it's from the British Caribbean islands to the Americas and back, or vice versa, 50% of all British trade went to the colonies. So were the British going to be heavily affected by this boycott? Yeah. Questions there? No?
Did people fight and get killed over there?
Yeah. So in response to much of this, you had a group formed called the Sons of Liberty. One group formed known as the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty was a group that protested British authority. So they protested British authority. And some of the things that they would do is harass tax officials and tar and feather other British officials. So they would harass customs officials, tar and feather others. And the two Sons of Liberty, you guys have to know their leaders. One was Samuel Adams. He was one of the Sons of Liberty leaders. Samuel Adams, like the beer. And the other one was Paul Revere. Paul Revere. And I imagine you guys all know the story of Paul Revere. The British are coming, the British are coming. We'll talk about why that's not true. We'll talk about why that story is not true. And we'll talk about that story next time we meet. Okay, that's it for us today, folks. We'll continue the next time we meet.